Japan, 1854. Part 1. Whispers of the Mountain. The mountain was a world unto itself, a vast expanse of ancient trees and rugged cliffs, where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the sound of rustling leaves. The peaks rose like the jagged teeth of some sleeping dragon, their tips often shrouded in mist, giving the entire landscape an ethereal, almost otherworldly feel. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, where the chaos of the world below could not penetrate. Here, high above the villages and towns, lived Kenshin, a man whose life had once been filled with honor and duty, but was now defined by solitude and regret. The path that led him to this mountain was one paved with blood and failure. Once a proud samurai, Kenshin had known the respect of his peers and the admiration of his lord. His sword had been swift and sure, his resolve unshakable. But all of that had crumbled in a single, catastrophic moment. A battle lost, a lord betrayed, and a code of honor shattered. For years, Kenshin had wandered, his heart heavy with the burden of his failure, until finally he could no longer bear the weight of the world's judgment. He retreated to the mountains, seeking the isolation that only such a place could offer. Here, he believed, he could escape the whispers of his past, the voices that called him a traitor, a failure, a man unworthy of the title samurai. Kenshin's home was a simple hut, built from the wood of fallen trees and the stones he had gathered from the mountainside. It was small and unadorned, a stark contrast to the grand estates he had once known. Inside, there was little more than a futon, a small hearth, and a few utensils. The walls were bare, save for a single scroll that hung above his sleeping mat, its inked characters faded but still legible. Honor is the foundation of the warrior, a cruel reminder of all he had lost. Each day, Kenshin would wake before the sun, the chill of the mountain air biting at his skin. He would sit outside his hut, watching as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the peaks in a soft, golden glow. It was in these quiet moments that he found a semblance of peace, a brief respite from the torment of his memories. The mountain, with its vastness and solitude, offered him a kind of solace, a place where he could lose himself in the rhythm of nature. He spent his days wandering the slopes, exploring the hidden valleys and secret groves that only the mountain knew. He became familiar with every tree, every rock, every stream that wound its way down to the valleys below. The mountain was his only companion, its silence both a comfort and a torment. It was here, in this isolation, that Kenshin believed he could atone for his sins, though he did not yet know how. But no matter how far he wandered, no matter how deeply he immersed himself in the wilderness, Kenshin could not escape the ghosts that haunted him. They came to him in the quiet of the night, when the world was still and the only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. In his dreams, he would see the faces of those he had failed, his lord who had trusted him, his comrades who had followed him, and the innocents caught in the crossfire of his mistakes. Their eyes would bore into him, filled with accusations and sorrow, and Kenshin would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the weight of his guilt crushing him. It was in this state of despair that the monk first appeared. At first, he was nothing more than a figure at the edge of Kenshin's dreams, a shadowy presence that seemed to watch him from afar. Kenshin would catch glimpses of him in the distance, a flash of robes, a glint of light off a shaved head, but he could never make out the monk's face. The presence unnerved him, though he could not say why. It was as if the monk carried with him a weight, a purpose that Kenshin could not yet understand. Over time, the monk's presence grew more insistent. He began to appear more frequently in Kenshin's dreams, always at the periphery, always watching. Kenshin could feel the monk's gaze upon him, a gaze that seemed to penetrate deep into his soul, to see the darkness that lurked there. The monk never spoke, but his silence was more powerful than any words could have been. It was a silence that demanded attention, that filled Kenshin with a sense of unease, as if something was expected of him, something he was not yet ready to give. One night, the monk came closer than ever before. Kenshin was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind whipping at his hair and clothes, the sky above him dark and stormy. Below, the world stretched out in all directions, a vast expanse of wilderness and shadow. The monk stood beside him, his robes fluttering in the wind, his face still obscured. Kenshin could feel the monk's presence more strongly than ever, a force that seemed to draw him in, to compel him to listen. "Why do you haunt me?" Kenshin finally asked, his voice raw with frustration and fear. "What do you want from me?" The monk did not respond, but for the first time, Kenshin could see his face, partially illuminated by a flash of lightning. It was a face of calm, of serenity, but also of deep wisdom and sorrow. The monk's eyes, dark and penetrating, held Kenshin's gaze, and in that moment, Kenshin felt a surge of emotion. Fear, anger, desperation, all crashing over him like the waves of a stormy sea. The monk raised a hand, pointing to the horizon, where the faint outline of a village could be seen, nestled at the base of the mountain. The village was small, its lights flickering like stars in the darkness, and Kenshin felt a strange pull towards it, a sense of connection that he did not understand. "You have been chosen," the monk said, his voice low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "There is a village at the foot of this mountain. They need you, Kenshin. Their suffering is great, and you are the one who can help them." Kenshin recoiled, shaking his head in denial. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I cannot help them. I am no longer a samurai. I am nothing." But the monk's gaze did not waver. "You are more than you believe," he said softly. "Your path is not yet finished. You were not brought to this mountain to die in despair, but to find your purpose, your redemption. The village needs you, Kenshin, and you need them." Kenshin turned away, unable to bear the weight of the monk's words. The memories of his failures were too fresh, too raw. He had come to this mountain to escape, to hide from the world, not to take on more responsibility. How could he, a broken man, possibly save anyone? But the monk's presence remained, a constant, unwavering force that would not be denied. "It is not about your past," the monk continued, his voice a gentle but firm command. "It is about what you choose to do now, in this moment. The divine has called you, Kenshin. Will you answer?" Kenshin felt a tear slip down his cheek, mingling with the rain that had begun to fall. He was torn between the life he had known and the life that was being offered to him, a life of purpose and redemption, but also of pain and sacrifice. He had spent so long running from his past, burying himself in the solitude of the mountain, that the thought of stepping back into the world filled him with dread. Yet, deep within him, a spark of something long dormant began to stir, a sense of duty, of honor, that he thought he had lost forever. The monk's words resonated in his soul, challenging him to rise above his despair, to find the strength to face his past and forge a new path. Kenshin did not sleep that night. He sat by the fire in his hut, staring into the flames as the storm raged outside. The monk's words echoed in his mind, a relentless drumbeat that would not be silenced. He thought of the village at the foot of the mountain, of the people who lived there, struggling to survive in the face of unimaginable hardship. He thought of his own failures, of the lives lost because of his mistakes, and he wondered if this was his chance to make amends. As the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, Kenshin made his decision. He would go to the village. He did not know if he could save them, but he knew he had to try. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. With a heavy heart, but a newfound resolve, Kenshin prepared to leave the mountain that had been his refuge and his prison. He gathered his few belongings, his sword, long and used but still sharp, his tattered clothes, a reminder of the life he had left behind, and a small bundle of provisions. As he stepped out of his hut, the mountain seemed to sigh around him, as if bidding farewell to the man who had walked its slopes for so long. Kenshin took one last look at the place that had been his home, the place where he had sought to find peace and redemption, but had found only more questions. The mountain had given him solitude, but it had not given him the answers he sought. Perhaps those answers lay in the village below, in the lives he was being called to save. And so, with a heart full of doubt, but a spirit rekindled, Kenshin began his descent from the mountain, the path before him uncertain, but the call to action undeniable. He did not know what awaited him in the village, but he knew that he could no longer hide from his destiny. The time had come to face his past, to find his purpose, and to seek the redemption that had eluded him for so long. As he walked, the mountain's whispers followed him, urging him onward, reminding him that his journey was just beginning. Part 2. Beneath the Ruins. Kenshin's journey down the mountain was arduous, both physically and emotionally. The path was steep and treacherous, winding through dense forests and across rocky outcroppings. But the real challenge lay within Kenshin's heart. Each step he took away from the solitude of the mountain felt like a betrayal of the fragile peace he had found there. Yet, the monk's words echoed in his mind, urging him forward, reminding him that his path to redemption lay in the village below. As Kenshin descended, the air grew warmer, the scent of pine and earth giving way to the acrid smell of smoke and decay. He could hear the faint sounds of life, a distant cry, the murmur of voices. But these sounds were laced with a kind of despair that made Kenshin's chest tighten. The village was close, and with each step, the weight of his responsibility pressed heavier upon him. When Kenshin finally emerged from the forest and caught sight of the village, he stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. What lay before him was a scene of utter devastation. The village, once a thriving community nestled at the base of the mountain, was now little more than a collection of ruins. Houses had been reduced to piles of splintered wood and shattered stone, their roofs caved in, walls crumbling. The ground was scarred with deep fissures, remnants of the recent earthquakes that had torn the earth apart. Smoke still rose from a few smoldering heaps, the last traces of fires that had consumed what little remained. Kenshin's heart ached as he took in the scene. This was not the village he had expected to find. He had imagined a place of suffering, yes, but not of such total destruction. The scale of the damage was overwhelming, and for a moment, Kenshin felt a surge of doubt. How could he possibly help these people? How could one man, broken and lost, restore a village that had been so thoroughly destroyed? But then he saw them, the villagers. They were moving slowly among the ruins, their movements lethargic and heavy with exhaustion. Their clothes were tattered, their faces gaunt and hollowed by hunger and despair. Kenshin could see the weight of their suffering in their eyes, a deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to have drained the very life from them. Children clung to their parents, their once bright eyes now dull and empty. The elderly huddled together, their bodies frail and bent, as if they could no longer bear the burden of their own existence. Kenshin approached the village cautiously, his presence met with wary glances from those who noticed him. He must have looked like a ghost to them, a figure draped in the ragged clothes of a hermit, with a sword at his side that seemed out of place in this world of ruin. Whispers spread among the villagers, but no one dared to approach him. They were too weary, too broken to hope that this stranger could bring them anything but more pain. As Kenshin walked deeper into the village, he came across a group of men working to clear the rubble from what had once been the village square. Their hands were bloodied and raw from the effort, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. They worked in silence, their eyes downcast, their spirits crushed by the enormity of the task before them. Kenshin could see that they were on the brink of collapse, their bodies and minds pushed beyond their limits. It was then that an elderly man stepped forward, his back bent with age, but his eyes still sharp with the wisdom of years. He wore the robes of a village elder, though they were now little more than rags, torn and dirted by the hardships he had endured. Despite his frail appearance, there was a strength in his posture, a resilience that had not yet been extinguished. "Who are you?" the elder asked, his voice cracked and weary, but steady. "And why have you come to our village?" Kenshin hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He had no grand speech, no promises of salvation. He was just a man who had failed in the past and who now stood before them, uncertain of his own worth. But the monk's words echoed in his mind, urging him to speak, to offer what little he could. "My name is Kenshin," he said finally, his voice low but clear. "I was sent here to help you, to protect you." The villagers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of hope and skepticism. They had been through so much. Could they really trust this stranger, this man who appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be their savior? The elder studied Kenshin for a long moment, his gaze piercing and thoughtful, as if searching for something in the depths of Kenshin's soul. After what felt like an eternity, the elder nodded, a flicker of hope lighting his tired eyes. "We are grateful for any help," he said, his voice tinged with both relief and resignation. "But you must understand, there is little left to save. Our homes are gone, our fields destroyed. We have lost so much, too much." Kenshin felt a pang of guilt. How could he, a man who had failed so many times before, possibly save these people? The task seemed insurmountable, and yet he knew he could not turn away. "I will do what I can," he promised, his voice firm with a resolve that surprised even himself. "But I cannot do it alone. I need your trust, and I need your help." The elder nodded again, this time with more conviction. "You have it," he said simply. Over the next few days, Kenshin threw himself into the work of rebuilding the village. It was grueling, back-breaking labor, but Kenshin welcomed the physical exertion, using it as a way to drown out the doubts and fears that still gnawed at him. He worked alongside the villagers, lifting stones, cutting wood, and clearing debris. He did not speak much, letting his actions speak for him, and slowly, the villagers began to warm to him. They saw the determination in his eyes, the way he pushed himself beyond his limits, and they began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this man could lead them out of the darkness. But as the days passed, Kenshin realized that rebuilding the village was not just a physical task. It was a spiritual one as well. The villagers had lost more than just their homes. They had lost their sense of purpose, their belief in the future. They were like the ruins they lived among, broken, fragmented, and unsure of how to piece themselves back together. Kenshin understood this feeling all too well. He had spent years in a similar state, wandering through life without direction, haunted by his past. But now, as he worked alongside the villagers, he began to see that perhaps his purpose was not just to rebuild their homes, but to help them rebuild their spirits as well. He began to lead the villagers in small rituals, simple prayers and meditations that he had learned during his time on the mountain. At first, the villagers were hesitant, unsure of what to make of these strange practices. But Kenshin's calm, steady presence gave them comfort, and gradually, they began to participate. They gathered each morning and evening, offering prayers to the spirits of the mountain, asking for protection and guidance. These moments of collective prayer brought a sense of unity to the village, a reminder that they were not alone in their suffering. Kenshin also took it upon himself to teach the villagers how to defend themselves. The bandits who had been preying on the village had taken advantage of the villagers' weakened state. But Kenshin knew that if they were to survive, they needed to be able to protect what little they had left. He trained the men in basic combat techniques, teaching them how to use the tools and weapons they had at hand. He showed them how to set up defenses around the village, creating barriers and traps that would deter any would-be attackers. As the days turned into weeks, the village began to show signs of life once more. The villagers, inspired by Kenshin's leadership, threw themselves into the work of rebuilding with renewed vigor. They repaired their homes, cleared the fields, and began to plant new crops. The children, who had once wandered aimlessly through the ruins, now played together, their laughter a welcome sound in the otherwise quiet village. Kenshin watched all of this with a sense of quiet satisfaction, but also with a lingering unease. He knew that the true test had not yet come. The bandits were still out there, and it was only a matter of time before they returned. Kenshin could feel the tension in the air, the way the villagers glanced nervously at the horizon, waiting for the day when the peace they had fought so hard to reclaim would be shattered once more. But for now, there was hope. And for Kenshin, that was enough. He had come to the village as a broken man, unsure of his purpose, but now he could feel a sense of direction returning to him. He was not just rebuilding the village, he was rebuilding himself, piece by piece, finding strength in the people he had been sent to protect. And so, Kenshin continued to work, his resolve growing stronger with each passing day. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The village, once a place of despair, was now a beacon of hope, and Kenshin was determined to protect it, no matter the cost. As the sun set each evening, casting long shadows across the village, Kenshin would stand at the edge of the square, watching the villagers as they went about their tasks. The sky would turn from orange to pink to deep blue, and Kenshin would feel a deep sense of peace settle over him. He was no longer running from his past. He was facing it head-on, with the strength of a warrior and the heart of a protector. And in those quiet moments, as the first stars began to appear in the sky, Kenshin would offer a silent prayer to the spirits of the mountain, thanking them for guiding him to this place, to these people. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Part 3. Shadows at Dusk. As the days turned into weeks, the village slowly began to heal. The sound of hammers striking nails and the sight of newly built walls were evidence of the villagers' determination to reclaim their lives. But the shadow of the bandits loomed ever closer, a threat that could undo all they had struggled to rebuild. Kenshin knew that their return was inevitable, and he prepared himself for the confrontation that would test every ounce of his strength and resolve. The temple at the edge of the village had once been a place of worship, its walls adorned with intricate carvings, and its courtyard filled with the scent of incense. But now, it stood in ruins, its once majestic structure reduced to a crumbling shell by the earthquakes that had ravaged the land. The temple's broken columns and shattered roof served as a stark reminder of the village's fragility, and it was here that Kenshin chose to make his stand. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the landscape, Kenshin moved quietly through the village, his senses alert. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm. The villagers, though weary, had found solace in their daily routines, but Kenshin could see the fear that still lingered in their eyes. They knew the bandits would return, and despite the training Kenshin had given them, they were not warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, and mothers, people who had been forced to take up arms to defend their homes, but who were not accustomed to the violence that now threatened their lives. Kenshin reached the temple just as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the mountains, plunging the world into twilight. The temple courtyard, once a place of peace and reflection, now felt ominous, the broken stone statues and overgrown weeds creating an eerie atmosphere. Kenshin could feel the weight of the place, as if the spirits of the past were watching, waiting to see what would unfold. He moved with purpose, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his mind focused on the task ahead. The bandits were ruthless, driven by greed and a lust for power, and Kenshin knew that they would not be easily deterred. But he also knew that he could not allow them to destroy what the villagers had worked so hard to rebuild. This was his responsibility, his chance to atone for the mistakes of his past. The night deepened, and the first signs of the bandits' approach became evident. Kenshin heard the distant rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig underfoot. He could sense them moving through the forest, their presence like a dark stain spreading across the land. He positioned himself at the entrance of the temple, where the narrow path would force the bandits to approach in single file, giving him the advantage. The first bandit appeared out of the darkness, his face obscured by the shadows. Kenshin's eyes narrowed, his body tensing as he prepared for the inevitable clash. The bandit moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the ruins, clearly aware that something was amiss. But before he could react, Kenshin struck. His blade flashed in the moonlight, slicing through the air with deadly precision. The bandit fell silently, his body crumpling to the ground, his sword clattering against the stones. Kenshin pulled back, his breath steady, his senses sharp. He knew the others would soon follow, drawn by the sound of their fallen comrade. And they did, emerging from the trees like specters, their eyes gleaming with malice. There were more of them than Kenshin had anticipated, their numbers seemingly endless as they poured into the temple grounds. But Kenshin stood firm, his resolve unshaken. The battle that ensued was fierce and brutal. Kenshin moved with the grace and precision of a seasoned warrior, his sword an extension of his will. He fought not just with skill, but with a sense of purpose that drove him to push beyond his limits. Each bandit that fell was a victory, a step closer to securing the safety of the village. But the bandits were relentless, their attacks coming in waves, forcing Kenshin to stay on the defensive. The temple, once a place of sanctuary, now became a battlefield. The sound of clashing swords echoed through the night, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the dying. Kenshin's movements were swift, each strike calculated, each defense executed with perfect timing. But the numbers were overwhelming, and despite his best efforts, he knew that he could not hold them off forever. As the battle raged on, Kenshin caught sight of the bandit leader, a towering figure clad in dark armor, his face marked by a long, jagged scar that ran from his temple to his chin. The leader moved with a confidence born of cruelty, his eyes locking on Kenshin with a predatory gleam. He was a man who had risen to power through violence and fear, and he saw in Kenshin a challenge to his authority that could not be ignored. The leader approached, his sword drawn, a sneer curling his lips. "So, you're the samurai who's been giving my men so much trouble," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I expected more." Kenshin did not respond, his focus entirely on the man before him. He could feel the exhaustion creeping into his limbs, the sting of his wounds beginning to take their toll, but he pushed the pain aside. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the village. The bandit leader lunged, his attack swift and brutal, but Kenshin was ready. He parried the blow, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through his body. The two men clashed in a flurry of strikes, each testing the other's skill and resolve. The leader was strong, his attacks powerful and relentless, but Kenshin fought with a determination that was born of something deeper than mere survival. He was fighting for the village, for the people who had placed their trust in him, for the chance to redeem himself. The battle between the two warriors was a dance of death, each move calculated, each strike deadly. Kenshin could feel his strength waning, but he refused to give in. He knew that if he fell, the village would fall with him. He had come too far, fought too hard to let that happen. In a final, desperate move, Kenshin feigned a stumble, luring the bandit leader into a moment of overconfidence. The leader took the bait, lunging forward with a powerful strike, but Kenshin was faster. He sidestepped the attack, bringing his sword down in a swift arc that caught the leader off guard. The blade found its mark, cutting deep into the man's side, and the leader staggered, his eyes wide with shock. Kenshin didn't hesitate. He followed through with a second strike, this one aimed at the leader's exposed neck. The blade sliced cleanly through, and the bandit leader fell to the ground, his life extinguished in an instant. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their confidence shattered. Kenshin, though barely able to stand, raised his sword, his voice ringing out in the night. "Leave now and never return," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The bandits, their will broken, turned and fled into the darkness, their retreat as chaotic as their attack had been calculated. Kenshin watched them go, his sword still raised, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had won, but the cost had been high. As the last of the bandits disappeared into the forest, Kenshin finally allowed himself to relax, his sword slipping from his grasp as he sank to his knees. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the battle was gone, leaving him weak and barely able to keep his eyes open. His body was battered, his wounds severe, but as he looked around the temple courtyard, he knew that he had done what he had come to do. The village was safe, at least for now. Kenshin's breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurring as the pain of his injuries began to overwhelm him. But even as darkness crept in at the edges of his consciousness, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced the bandits, protected the village, and in doing so, he had taken another step toward redemption. As he lay on the cold stone floor of the temple, Kenshin's thoughts drifted to the villagers, to the people who had become his family in a way he had never expected. He had fought for them, bled for them, and he would continue to do so for as long as he had breath in his body. And in the silence that followed the battle, Kenshin made a vow to himself. He would not allow the village to fall. He would protect it with everything he had, for as long as he could, because in doing so, he was not just saving the village, he was saving himself. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, casting a soft glow over the temple ruins, Kenshin closed his eyes, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion that had been held at bay by sheer willpower. He had survived the night, but he knew that the true battle was far from over. And so, as the world slowly came back to life around him, Kenshin allowed himself to rest, knowing that when the time came, he would be ready to fight again. Part 4. Awakening of the Spirit. The days following the battle with the bandits were a blur of activity and recovery. The villagers, having witnessed Kenshin's bravery and the defeat of their tormentors, were filled with a renewed sense of purpose and gratitude. The village, once teetering on the brink of despair, now pulsed with life as the people worked together to rebuild what had been destroyed. Kenshin, despite his injuries, was at the center of this transformation, guiding the villagers not only in the physical restoration of their homes, but in the spiritual revival of their community. The shrine, a place that had once been the heart of the village's spiritual life, had suffered greatly during the earthquakes. Its walls had crumbled, the sacred statues toppled, and the courtyard overgrown with weeds. Yet, despite its dilapidated state, the shrine held a deep significance for the villagers. It was a symbol of their faith, a connection to the divine forces they believed watched over them. Kenshin understood this, and he knew that restoring the shrine was not just about rebuilding a structure. It was about restoring the villagers' connection to their spiritual roots. Kenshin had spent his life as a samurai, bound by a code of honor that had been shattered by his own failures. But now, in this small village at the foot of the mountain, he began to understand that true strength did not come from the blade of a sword, but from the spirit within. The shrine became a focal point for this realization, a place where Kenshin could channel his newfound understanding into something tangible, something that could heal not just his own wounded soul, but the souls of those around him. With the help of the villagers, Kenshin began the arduous task of rebuilding the shrine. It was slow, painstaking work, requiring not just physical labor, but a deep reverence for the sacredness of the place. The villagers, inspired by Kenshin's dedication, approached the task with a solemnity and respect that belied their earlier despair. They worked together, each person contributing what they could, whether it was hauling stones, carving new statues, or tending to the small garden that surrounded the shrine. As the shrine took shape, so too did the village's spirit. The act of rebuilding became a form of collective prayer, a way for the villagers to express their gratitude for having survived the trials that had befallen them. Kenshin led them in this effort, not as a warrior, but as a guide, a man who had once been lost, but who had found his way back through the simple acts of service and devotion. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the village, Kenshin stood before the nearly completed shrine. The air was thick with the scent of incense, the soft murmur of prayers mingling with the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. The villagers had gathered, their faces glowing with the light of the lanterns that surrounded the shrine, their eyes filled with a quiet reverence. Kenshin felt a deep sense of peace as he gazed at the shrine. It was not just a building. It was a testament to the strength and resilience of the human spirit. The villagers had poured their hearts into its restoration, and in doing so, they had begun to heal the wounds that had been inflicted upon them. Kenshin knew that the shrine would stand as a symbol of their unity and faith for generations to come. As the villagers continued their prayers, Kenshin walked around the shrine, taking in the details that had been lovingly restored. The stone statues of the gods, once broken and scattered, now stood proudly once more, their faces serene and watchful. The walls, once crumbling, had been rebuilt with care, each stone placed with intention and respect. The garden, which had been overrun with weeds, now bloomed with vibrant flowers, their colors a reflection of the hope that had been rekindled in the hearts of the villagers. Kenshin paused at the entrance to the shrine, where a large wooden door had been newly hung. It was adorned with intricate carvings of dragons and phoenixes, symbols of strength and rebirth. The craftsmanship was exquisite, a testament to the skill and dedication of the village's artisans. Kenshin ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves and lines that had been etched into the wood with such care. It was in this moment, standing before the door to the shrine, that Kenshin felt a shift within himself. The burdens he had carried for so long, the guilt, the shame, the sense of failure, began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and clarity that he had not felt in years. He realized that his journey was not just about redemption, but about transformation. He had come to this village as a broken man, seeking to atone for his past, but he had found something far more profound. He had found a new path, one that was not defined by the sword, but by the spirit. The villagers noticed the change in Kenshin. They saw it in the way he moved, the way he spoke with a calm authority that inspired trust and respect. He was no longer the warrior haunted by his past. He was a leader, a protector, a man who had embraced his role in the village not out of obligation, but out of a deep sense of love and responsibility. The villagers began to look to him not just as a savior, but as a spiritual guide, someone who could help them navigate the challenges that lay ahead. As the days passed, Kenshin took on this role with humility and grace. He led the villagers in daily prayers at the shrine, teaching them the rituals and traditions that had been passed down through generations. These were not the rituals of the samurai, but of the common people, simple, heartfelt expressions of faith that connected them to the land, to their ancestors, and to the divine. Kenshin found solace in these practices, a sense of connection that he had not known before. It was as if, in guiding the villagers, he was also guiding himself, finding his way back to a place of inner peace. The shrine became a place of gathering, a sanctuary where the villagers could come to find solace and strength. It was here that they brought their worries, their fears, their hopes. And Kenshin, standing at the head of the shrine, would listen, offering words of comfort and wisdom, drawn not from the teachings of the samurai, but from the lessons he had learned through his own trials. But Kenshin knew that the journey was not over. The village had been rebuilt, the shrine restored, but the shadow of the bandits still lingered. He could feel it in the air, a tension that hung over the village like a storm waiting to break. The villagers, though stronger and more united than before, were not yet free from the threat that had haunted them for so long. Kenshin understood that the true test of their resolve was still to come. And so, as he stood before the shrine one evening, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Kenshin made a silent vow. He would protect this village, not just with his sword, but with his heart. He would stand against whatever darkness came their way, not out of a sense of duty, but out of love for the people who had given him a second chance. He would fight, not just for their survival, but for their spirit, the spirit that had been awakened in him, and in them through the trials they had faced together. As night fell, Kenshin closed his eyes, feeling the cool breeze on his face, the scent of incense still lingering in the air. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that he was not alone. The villagers stood with him, and together they would face whatever challenges the future held. Because now, more than ever, Kenshin understood that true strength came not from the sword, but from the unity of a people who believed in something greater than themselves. And in that unity, Kenshin had found his redemption. Part 5: Echoes of Sacrifice. The storm descended upon the village with a ferocity that matched the tension in the air. Dark clouds roiled above, their shadows stretching long and ominous across the landscape. The wind howled through the trees, bending them to its will, while lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene with brief, blinding flashes. The villagers huddled in their homes, fear gripping their hearts, for they knew what the storm heralded: the return of the bandits, more numerous and more determined than ever. Kenshin stood alone at the edge of the village, his figure barely visible in the gathering darkness. The shrine behind him, its newly restored walls glowing faintly in the dim light, stood as a silent witness to the events about to unfold. Kenshin's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his grip firm, though his heart was heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had known this moment would arrive, had sensed it in the shifting winds and in the quiet dread that had settled over the village in the days leading up to the storm. Now it was here. The first sign of the bandits' approach was the flicker of torchlight at the edge of the forest. It was quickly followed by the sound of tramping feet, the dull thud of hooves on the muddy ground, and the clinking of weapons. The bandits emerged from the shadows, their numbers far greater than before, their eyes gleaming with malice. They had returned, not just to plunder, but to destroy, to reclaim what they saw as rightfully theirs. And standing in their way was Kenshin, the lone warrior who had defied them once and who now stood as the last line of defense for the village. Kenshin's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear, his resolve unshaken. He knew the odds were against him. He was one man against many, but he also knew that he could not allow the bandits to reach the village. He had promised the villagers that he would protect them, and he intended to keep that promise, even if it cost him his life. As the bandits advanced, Kenshin stepped forward, his sword drawn, its blade gleaming in the flickering torchlight. The leader of the bandits, a tall man with a cruel smile and eyes that glinted with a sinister light, rode at the front of the group. He reined in his horse, regarding Kenshin with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "So, you're the one who's been causing us so much trouble," the leader said, his voice carrying over the sound of the storm. "I'll admit, I didn't expect you to be so foolish as to stand against us again. But no matter, you'll die tonight, and this village will burn." Kenshin said nothing, his eyes fixed on the leader, his expression calm but determined. The leader's smile faded as he realized that Kenshin was not afraid, that the warrior before him was prepared to fight to the death. "Kill him," the leader ordered, his voice hard, "and make sure he suffers." The bandits surged forward, their weapons raised, their faces twisted with bloodlust. Kenshin met them head-on, his movements swift and precise, his sword a blur as it cut through the air. He fought with a skill that came not just from years of training, but from a deep, unwavering resolve. Every strike was delivered with purpose, every defense executed with perfect timing. The bandits fell one by one, their attacks no match for Kenshin's mastery of the blade. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every bandit that fell, another took his place, and soon Kenshin found himself surrounded, his body straining under the relentless assault. His breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning with exertion, but he did not falter. He knew that he could not afford to. If he fell, the village would be lost. The storm intensified, rain lashing down in sheets, turning the ground beneath Kenshin's feet into a slick, treacherous mire. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the battle in stark, brief glimpses, the gleam of steel, the flash of eyes, the spray of blood. Kenshin could feel his strength waning, but he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that he was all that stood between the bandits and the innocent lives they sought to destroy. Just when it seemed that Kenshin could fight no longer, a loud cry pierced the air, followed by the thunderous sound of hooves. From the shadows of the villagers emerged, armed with whatever they could find: pitchforks, scythes, wooden staves. They charged at the bandits, their faces set with grim determination. They were not warriors, but they were fighting for their homes, their families, and the man who had given everything to protect them. The sudden assault from the villagers caught the bandits off guard, their ranks breaking as they struggled to fend off the unexpected attack. Kenshin seized the opportunity, rallying his remaining strength to strike down the bandits closest to him. The leader, seeing the tide turning, spurred his horse forward, determined to end Kenshin's life once and for all. Kenshin met the leader's charge, their swords clashing with a force that reverberated through the storm. The leader was strong, his attacks brutal and relentless, but Kenshin fought with a quiet ferocity, his movements guided by a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. The battle between them was fierce, each man pushing the other to the limits of his strength. In a final, desperate move, the leader raised his sword high, preparing to deliver a fatal blow. But Kenshin, with a speed that belied his exhaustion, stepped aside at the last moment, his sword flashing out in a swift, precise arc. The leader's eyes widened in shock as the blade found its mark, cutting deep into his side. He toppled from his horse, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud, his life ebbing away with the rain that poured from the sky. With the fall of their leader, the remaining bandits hesitated, their will to fight shattered. They turned and fled into the night, their retreat marked by the sounds of their panicked flight. The villagers, exhausted but victorious, watched them go, their cheers rising above the sound of the storm. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. But the victory came at a cost. Kenshin, his strength finally spent, collapsed to his knees, his sword slipping from his grasp. His vision blurred, the world around him fading into a haze of rain and darkness. He had fought with everything he had, and now, at last, his body could take no more. The villagers rushed to Kenshin's side, their faces filled with concern and gratitude. They lifted him gently, carrying him back to the shrine, where they laid him down on a bed of soft blankets. The storm raged on outside, but within the shrine, there was a sense of calm, a quiet reverence for the man who had given so much to protect them. Kenshin, his breathing shallow, looked up at the faces of the villagers gathered around him. He could see the worry in their eyes, but also the respect, the gratitude. He had done what he had set out to do. He had protected the village, and in doing so, he had found the redemption he had been seeking. As the storm began to subside, the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a soft, golden glow over the shrine. Kenshin, his body weak but his heart at peace, closed his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. He had given everything he had, and now he could rest. The villagers watched as Kenshin's breathing slowed, his body finally succumbing to the wounds and exhaustion of the battle. They wept for him, their tears mingling with the rain that still fell outside, but they also knew that his spirit would live on, a guardian watching over the village he had saved. They buried Kenshin at the foot of the shrine, beneath a cherry tree that would bloom each spring, its petals a reminder of the sacrifice he had made. They marked his grave with a simple stone, inscribed with words that would echo through the generations. Kenshin, protector of the village, redeemed by honor and sacrifice. And so, the story of Kenshin, the warrior who found redemption in the service of others, became legend, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The villagers, forever grateful for the man who had saved them, continued to honor his memory, passing down the story to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that Kenshin's legacy would never be forgotten. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees and the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers would sometimes feel a presence among them, a whisper on the breeze, a shadow in the corner of their vision. They knew it was Kenshin, watching over them, his spirit forever bound to the village he had given his life to protect. And in those moments, they would offer a prayer of thanks, knowing that Kenshin's sacrifice had not been in vain, and that his spirit would always be with them, guiding and protecting them just as he had in life. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.